Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining me to come and talk about accessibility today. A little bit of information about me. My name is Maya Miller. I work at Catalyst IT, which is an open source company out here in New Zealand. I'm also a front-end developer. So yes, I am based in New Zealand. I'm Canadian, which is why I sound like this. But let's get started. Let's talk about accessibility. We're going to go through the what, the why, the how, all about it. So before we begin, I have some questions to ask you, so I'm going to pretend that I can see you. But let's say, first, have you ever watched TV or a movie with captions on? Anyone? Yeah, I bet a whole chunk of you. How about, have you ever had difficulty seeing your phone screen when you were outside in this bright sunlight? Probably just about all of us. Have you ever filled in a form that you found confusing? I'm sure we all have funny stories about those. And have you ever met someone who has arthritis, or maybe you yourself have arthritis? So if you've answered yes to any or all of these questions, congratulations, you benefit from accessible design. So let's understand more about what accessibility actually is. It's the practice and degree to which everyone can use websites, tools, and technology. So specifically what that means is about perceiving, understanding, navigating, and interacting with those things. But the key takeaway here is that web accessibility is for everyone. I just before I begin talking about language, so language is really important and it influences the way that we do think about things. So there's a lot of debate in the community about how we discuss ability. So just in this presentation, I chose people-centered language, and I do use the word disability. I have choices and reasons behind that, but there is a continued debate around it. So I just kind of want that disclaimer so we don't get too bogged down about it and we can have the conversation later. But so let's talk about accessibility. So who is it for exactly? So there's the traditional ideas of those with disabilities. So disabilities has all sorts of types: auditory, cognitive, neurological, physical speech, visual. Visual, for example, is a spectrum though. You know, you can be completely blind, partially, have low vision, or colorblind as well. But accessibility is also for those without disabilities, or the conventional sense of disabilities. So we're thinking about different screen sizes, temporary disabilities. So that might be you broke your arm. Like I'm a right-handed person, I use that for everything. So if I break my right hand or my right arm, instantly things are going to get a lot harder for me. I'm going to rely a lot more on the keyboard. My dexterity is going to be a lot lower because I'm going to be using my left hand for things. Situational limitations, that's our standing outside in the bright sun, for example, as well as slow internet. So it impacts a whole bunch of people. And then the last group that's worth highlighting is the older population as well. With our aging population, this more and more impacts people. So just a statistic for you, 46% of those aged 60 plus have some form of disability. So, you know, we're really talking about a lot of people here. But let's talk more about accessibility, why exactly we go about doing it. So I have a few arguments for you in case you're still a little bit of a skeptic, not quite sure. So first off, it's good for business. So if you're working at a company or you're creating code that you hope other people are going to make use of, this is a good point to create accessible code. So first off, it's good for business. Over 1 billion people in the world are estimated to have a form of disability. In the US, that's about 61 million people. In the UK, it's 11 million. I'm sure there's people from all over the world coming to this conference, so the populations differ, but the numbers are high. And again, the prevalence goes up with age. So that's something worth taking note of, that if you're thinking about who's your target audience, if you're like, I don't know if this is my target audience, I bet it is. The second reason why it's good code is accessible code. If you're writing proper HTML, you're writing robust code, you're writing code that's compatible with other technologies and other frameworks. It's good code. It's also better for SEO. So accessible code and good code go hand in hand. And then also it's expensive to be inaccessible. So users we often have websites so that to take users off of phone and in-person forms of communication so that we can just give them the information that they want and need. But if they're not able to access the information on the website, then they're going to go through those more expensive channels. So it's in our best interest, or a business's best interest, to make sure that their website is accessible to everybody. More, you say? Okay. So why else should we do accessibility? Because it's the law, actually. So a whole bunch of different countries have a whole bunch of different legislations all about accessibility. Depending on where you live, that legislation might differ slightly. I listed some of the legislation in Canada, Europe, and the US. So different countries have different legislations, but those legislations cover public sector, cover private sector. So it's the law. And lawsuits can and do happen as well. So the US, we've seen thousands of lawsuits come up very recently. Those costs are expensive, and those are just to deal with the lawsuits. It's not actually to even fix the problem, to go back into development and make the changes that are necessary. So it's really expensive to deal with those lawsuits. And finally, we're talking about open source, right? So let's talk about open source. Making accessible code is good for open source, right? So first off is, if we think about compounded technical debt. So when we create open source, the idea is that people will use our code, right? We want other people to make use of it and to see it over and over again in the world. That's good open source code. But the more that our code gets reused, and if it has accessibility bugs in it, the more those issues are going to multiply and impact more people. So if we can really nip it in the butt with the source code that we create, if we can fix those accessibilities at the source, then we're preventing that multiplication of technical debt and of accessibility debts in the future. And then also just the warm fuzzies about open source. Open source is about making code and making technology open and available to everybody, right? So accessibility, it just makes sense. That's what we're all here for, is open source accessible code. Okay, so we're all on board. We're all like, yes, love open source accessibility. We all want to do it. So how do we go about doing it? So there's no one way to go about accessibility. There's a whole legislation around it, and there's a lot of tactics you can do. So whatever tactic or whatever means you go about addressing accessibility, you're doing it right. You're doing a good job. But if I may provide some guidance for you, some direction, if you will. So this here is a table from the WebAIM Million project. So WebAIM is an accessible organization for the web. And they have an annual project where they survey 1 million homepages with automated tools and pick up accessibility issues. So we can see some of the trends. And so they've done one already for 2021. And these are the top issues that they've noticed on those homepages. So we're going to talk about most of those things today. The rest of the talk is going to be a little bit more technical, but everybody should be able to keep up with it. So let's dive in about how to build accessible code. So first off, about color contrast. Sorry, got caught off a little bit there, but low contrast, that's one of the most common issues. So the guidelines have guidelines about the standards that you need to meet. So about large text, graphical components and inputs needs to meet 3:1, regular text 4.5:1, all that kind of stuff. Your best, easiest bet is to use a color contrast checker. So I like using the WebAIM one. Again, I have the link here, and that's again the same company that did the million dollar project, the Million project. And they have a color contrast checker, and it's great. You can also just literally search color contrast checker, and you'll have a bunch come up, and they're all great. They all use the same algorithm, so they're all effective. But this is what it looks like. So these are just some cropped images of WebAIM. So you can see you type in the foreground color and the background color based on the hex code. You can also customize it based on if you have the RGBs. And then you get the contrast ratio, which is those numbers that I listed at the beginning. But if you don't want to remember those numbers, it also tells you exactly where it passes and fails. And so there's different levels. If you are interested in knowing about the different levels, you can explore that, or we can talk. And it gives you pass fails based on the different ways that text appears and graphical objects appear. And then you can make adjustments on your colors in order to pass. So before you ask, yes, I did run my colors through a color contrast checker, and yes, they do pass. The blue that I use is not this same blue. So don't worry, we're all good. This is just for an example. And the reason why we care about color contrast is for our low vision users. But it also impacts people like our example at the top about when you're outside and just have a bright sun. Having high enough contrast on your screen is really helpful in those situations as well. So again, impacts a lot of people. So that's how to address color contrast, one of those issues. Let's explore something else. So missing alt text. So this is a really prevalent problem that happens a lot, and it's a really easy fix as well. So the idea behind providing alt text or alternative texts to images in general is that we should make sure that all of our users are getting a robust, complete, fair and equal experience of our web page, right? It's not really fair that some users are getting some experience, but the richness of that experience is different for other people. So that's the motivation behind this. So alt text, there's two principles about it. First off, you want to make sure that it is there. And then second, when it is there, that it's descriptive or accurate to what is being presented. So there's a lot we can talk about alt text, and yes, alt text is subjective at the end of the day, but there's still, you can use your common sense about it. And essentially, images break down into two main categories. The first one is informative, and then we have decorative. So if it's an informative image, you create your image tag, and then you have an alt text, and this is a descriptive alt text. So the alt text says, young person sitting in a coffee shop looking at a cell phone. Now, based on that alt text alone, if everybody watching were to pull out a pen and paper and draw a picture, I imagine that most people would actually have a pretty similar image, varying skill levels, but the image will be roughly the same. The details will be different, and that's where the subjectiveness comes in. So depending on what my web page is, I might highlight different details about the alt text. But the idea is that the image will be mostly the same across all of our images, and that's because it's a good descriptive alt text. So somebody who can't see, or somebody who has slow internet connection, when you can't see the image there, you get the alt text showing up, and so at least your experience can be almost or as rich as if you were able to see the image. And then the second kind of image is we have decorative. So these are, we have, just have decorative lines on the page, or maybe icons that aren't links and don't serve a purpose, like have text that accompanies it. And so in that case, there is a way that you can do it. You do alt equals and then just empty quotes. It's important that you do include alt equals empty quotes so that at least the browser has something to grab onto, and for screen readers, basically it'll skip the image. But if you don't include that, screen readers can start reading the source, the image source, and then you end up with like a whole long 3472 .img, and we don't want that. So for decorative things, easy as we just do alt equals empty. Next one, let's talk about forms. So this is another one that was highlighted by WebAIM. So basically, the principle here is use proper HTML. Make sure that you're using the for-ID method, and I have some code on the page as an example. The label has the for, the input has the ID, and just use proper HTML for forms. Don't use a span or a p tag and then an input field, because those are not programmatically connected. So when assistive technology like a screen reader is going through your web page, it won't connect those two fields together. It'll just read it separately. And those two things aren't connected. So we want to make sure that everybody understands that those two are together, that it's not just visual. And if you're not sure about it, check the docs. I use those docs all the time, and that'll clarify the proper HTML for you. And then the last one we'll go through is empty links and buttons. This basically, the technical is that all links and buttons must have discernible text, which means that a screen reader should be able to pick it up. So this often happens when we're using icons or images as buttons or links specifically. That's often what happens. So I have some examples on the slide that shows how we can code images and icons better so that it gets picked up. So if you're using an image as a link, which often we do, we have our news page with a bunch of different images, and then you can click on it. That's where our alt text comes in. So you can use the alt text to be descriptive of the link. So it says, click here for, or in this case, I have this week's deal. So it's not necessarily descriptive in this case of the image, but it is accurate of the role that the image plays. And again, we can talk about this, but the idea here that I want to get across is that there's text there, because what happens otherwise is that a screen reader comes to a link and all it says is link, and that's it. And so a screen reader user has no idea what the link is supposed to be. Maybe they can gather based on context, but there's not really much information there. So alt text is a way that if it's wrapped around by an anchor tag, providing alt text is a way that we can solve this problem. And then the other example that I have on screen is when we use icons. That's often that we're using for buttons. So again, it's a whole conversation, but essentially, because an icon is a visual, one technique is you can hide the visual icon, and then you provide a span that is for screen readers only. So it's visibility, sorry, not visibility, it's opacity 0 is a good technique to use. So it stays in the DOM, but visually is not there. And then it'll read out button save. So that's ways that we can think about our screen reader users and make sure they still understand what's going on, but we still have the visual cues and the visuals that we want for our sighted users. So that's a really brief, quick recap about accessibility and how we can implement it in our code. So the takeaways here is that accessibility impacts a massive amount of people. If you don't think it applies to the code that you're writing, you should seriously think again, because it really, really does. And again, as the population ages, we really have to expand our thinking about who accessibility applies to. It really is a lot of people. The second takeaway is good code is accessible code. If you don't know anything about accessibility, if you start focusing on just making sure your HTML is actually proper HTML, you're going to get a really far way. And then lastly, and this is something that I've heard from people who are heavily impacted by accessibility changes, it's that a small implementation that we do as developers can have a huge difference for these individuals. So it's really worth taking that little bit of extra time and little bit of extra effort from the beginning, implement accessibility, and then your code is good as gold. So thanks so much for attending and paying attention and listening and caring about this. I hope you took something away and you can implement. Again, my name is Maya Miller. I work out in New Zealand at Catalyst IT, and here's how you can contact me, all that good stuff. Thanks so much for your time.